What can people expect to happen next? Because again, it puts a spotlight on the fact that we really do need these on-ramps right now between fiat and
Correct.
Bitcoin. I know there are people who, um, just as they advocate for much less government and maybe the end of the Fed, they also say we can just operate on a Bitcoin standard. We don't need any of the other entities. But the reality is that for at least several decades to come, we do need, the systems to sort of coexist, even if we are to move to a total Bitcoin standard, right? So what do you want people to know? Where are sort of the risks, and why are you, I'm assuming you're hopeful that this is all going to move in the right direction.
Oh, I do believe cooler heads will prevail because, and again, some of it is what we know from the DC Civ that has told us what really happened. There are factions that are fighting each other within the Biden White House, and the Fed is all part of this. I don't understand why. Well, I have some sense why, but again, the Fed is supposed to be independent and is part of this group. And so, but again, there are factions within the Fed. There are factions within the SEC. There are factions within the FDIC too. These are not monoliths, and it just happened that the anti-crypto faction, proverbially, as Washington D.C. likes to say, didn't want to let a good crisis go to waste and made a very aggressive move. But that pendulum is going to swing back, and I do believe cooler heads are going to prevail because there are a number of folks who really do understand that they do want this stuff in the regulatory perimeter, and the good actors like us who were coming to them asking to be federally regulated, begging to be federally regulated, and trying to help them understand they were dealing with something that was new, and we were willing to roll up sleeves and teach them where the risks were. We saw what happened, but it's not over yet. It's not over yet for us. Stay tuned. We are looking at alternatives. We've had a number of banks, and I've got to say thank you to the bankers who have reached out to us. A number of banks are sympathetic to what's happened. They want to draft behind us. They know it's really hard for banks to sue their regulators, but they've been watching as the federal bank regulators have been overreaching for years.
Mhm.
And they're cheering us on. They can't say it publicly, but they're cheering us on and they're offering to help. And so stay tuned, because we've had multiple banks reach out offering to help and may be able to help us clear US dollars for our customers. But stay tuned also. It's not over with the Fed yet. It's far from over. As you know, we have multiple angles with the Fed that remain open, including an appeal on our application,
Mhm.
including the lawsuit, and just including ongoing conversations.
Yeah.
Because again, cooler heads, I think, will prevail. This whole thing, there are a lot of theatrics that were done here, orchestrated by the White House and Fed. And all right, you sent the message to the industry, got it. Everyone in the industry saw it. They saw the stallion get shot to scatter the herd, proverbially. And all right, now let's regroup and roll up sleeves and actually get something done.
As we start to wrap up, I really want to touch on this idea of Bitcoin becoming a global reserve asset, because I know that you feel very confident that it will, but yet you also say that the dollar will remain. 80% of world transactions are done in the U.S. dollar still. However, we are seeing shifts, right? Parallel systems that are being built by different countries, a
Yes.
de-dollarization over the last few years, especially in response to things like sanctions and the fact that we are just continually going further and further into debt. So why would someone hold our debt in their reserves? But can you talk a little bit about sort of how you see this all playing out? Because some people think it's a zero sum game, and it's either like a Bitcoin world or nothing. Others say that these
Mm-mm.
assets will kind of coexist. We will still have the dollar. Other fiat currencies will collapse into the dollar. How do you see this playing out? I mean, maybe just if you could zoom out and give us a general take. I know it could probably not manifest for decades, but how do you see this happening?
Well, it might manifest tomorrow, or it might not manifest for decades, right? And you and I talked earlier about, we kind of hope it doesn't manifest tomorrow because Bitcoin's not ready yet. We want Bitcoin to be ready when it does manifest. And I think that's a gradual process of infrastructure build and network effect propagation. But it's all geopolitical. That's the answer. We're moving into a multipolar world. And yes, you're right. I haven't spoken out much against the weaponization of the US dollar system, but it's perfectly foreseeable that if the US dollar system can only be used by friends, then the foes will try to figure out a way to move value outside of it. And that's exactly what's happening now. How much of that is really meaningful, and does it really matter? At the moment, it's not that meaningful. But if you go back in history, again, history always gives you good lessons. The offshore US dollar market was created in the 1950s during the Cold War because Russia, thanks to OPEC's decision to sell oil only in US dollars, it's a US dollar market, and Russia had to put its US dollars somewhere and use those US dollars, but due to the Cold War, they were shut out of the US banking system. So what happened? The British banks said, well, we'll open US dollar accounts for you. We don't need permission from the United States to do this. And thus was born the euro dollar market, the offshore dollar market. It's a misnomer, but that's what it is. Right. You can get US dollars offshore, never touching the US banks. Now, ultimately, if you're going to ever redeem those US dollars, everything ultimately has to settle back through the Federal Reserve, which is why it still has the power that it has. But most of those US dollars that circulate offshore never end up coming back onshore into the United States. And the bank regulators lost control of the Eurodollar market. They were able to gather some of it back through the Bank for International Settlements and these multi-country organizations including the IMF and World Bank, that basically are dollarized systems and brought power back. Because the countries cooperated with each other, and the US wielded its power in terms of access to ultimately redeeming those US dollars if the banks in those other countries, including Western European countries, were adhering to the multilateral rules. Okay, so that's essentially describing the multilateral system. But you are seeing people break ranks here. You are seeing countries break ranks. And I think that that's just a function of the fact that the U.S. is not the 10-ton gorilla, the only global power that it used to be. We're seeing multilateral, more regional powers pop up, and they're creating their own settlement systems for settling transactions outside of the U.S. dollar. And frankly, the U.S., if it really wants to keep its strength, needs to focus not on keeping the strength of the U.S. dollar, but needs to focus on keeping the strength of the U.S. economy. Yep. Because ultimately, what is fiat currency? It is essentially the balance sheet and the future productive capacity of every person and every piece of capital. By that, I mean like a capital equipment in the country. Yes. Okay, so it's a confidence game, and if you really do start to see the productivity of the people eroding for demographic reasons, or because the people stop working, et cetera, or their health goes down, then it's going to have an impact on the currency. And so these things matter. These macro mega trends matter, and the currency is reflecting all of them. And if the U.S. wants to retain its power in the world, it needs to ensure that it retains its power through the U.S. dollar, and frankly, employing these new technologies for the U.S. dollar, as Nick Carter says, are some of the smartest things the U.S. could be doing in order to extend the supremacy of the US dollar as reserve currency. And what are the bank regulators doing? They're doing the opposite. Again, we're acting out of fear, potentially ultimately gets them the very thing that they feared.